There is a rule in Longyearbyen that the world has mostly gotten wrong. People call it the law against dying. They say it is illegal to die here, that if you fall seriously ill, the authorities will carry you to an aircraft before you go, that death itself has been banned, by statute, by fine, by force, in the world's northernmost town. That is not quite right. What is true is stranger. In this town of roughly 2,000 people, above the 78th parallel in the Norwegian Arctic, no one has been buried in a coffin since the 1950s. The cemetery at the edge of town still stands. The wooden crosses are still there, leaning slightly in the frozen ground. But the earth beneath them has not accepted a new body in over 70 years. Because the earth here does not let things go. This is why. The ground beneath Longyearbyen is permafrost, permanently frozen, year-round for centuries. And permafrost, it turns out, is a kind of memory. In 1998, a team of scientists traveled to this small cemetery and exhumed the remains of Norwegian miners who had died in October 1918. Young men, 18 to 29 years old, newly arrived from the mainland. They had come for coal work. They died in a pandemic. 80 years later, the scientists opened the frozen ground and found the Spanish flu virus still present in the lung tissue of the dead, intact, viable. The burial ban is not theater, it is biosecurity. The rule exists because this place holds everything that enters it, and no one is entirely certain what it is holding. Svalbard means cold coast in Old Norse. The name is accurate. From the air, the archipelago looks like a shattered jawbone of rock and ice. 5 main islands, thousands of smaller ones, an area roughly the size of Ireland, more than 60% of which is covered by glacier. The largest island is Spitsbergen. That is where all the people are. That is where this story takes place. The surrounding sea freezes each winter. In summer, it opens just enough for ships to pass. The window is narrow. Life here has always required permission from the cold. The cold grants it reluctantly. The first recorded visit came in 1596, when Dutch explorer Willem Barents arrived on a voyage searching for the Northeast Passage, a sea route around the top of Asia to the trading markets of China. He found no passage. He found ice and rock and a coastline no European chart had named. Walrus crowding every shore, polar bears moving across the sea ice, bowhead whales traveling through fjords in numbers that no living European had ever seen. He named the largest island Spitsbergen, pointed mountains. Within a decade, the whalers came. By the early 17th century, Dutch, English, Danish, and Basque ships were converging on these waters in such numbers that nations began arguing over the right to hunt here. The bowhead whale was extraordinarily valuable. Its blubber rendered into oil for lamps across Europe. Its baleen stripped for corsets and carriage springs. A single bowhead could yield dozens of tons of oil. The hunting was catastrophic in its efficiency. Within a century, the bowhead whale had been hunted to near extinction in Svalbard's waters. Entire shores that had teemed with animal life fell quiet. The whalers followed the last populations further north into waters that were harder and more dangerous, until even those became empty. Behind them, at a place on the northwest coast called Smeerenberg, the blubber town, the ovens and equipment and accumulated debris of a century of industrial whaling remained. The bones of thousands of whales still scattered along the foreshore, bleached by seasons of light and dark. Some of those bones lie there still today. Then came the trappers, fur hunters who worked the fjords for Arctic fox and polar bear. They did what the whalers had never done. They stayed through winter. They built small cabins along the shore. They endured. The polar night. 4 months of complete darkness, alone, with provisions that sometimes ran short. Some of them did not survive to see the spring. The ones who did returned the following autumn because the work paid well, and Svalbard asked nothing of them except endurance. No country governed this place. No laws applied. It was what international law called terra nullius, no man's land, a place that belonged to whoever was strong enough to use it. It remained that way into the 20th century. The polar bear moves across the snowfield above the valley in the early morning, her 2 cubs pressing close to her flanks. She was born on Svalbard. Her mother was born on Svalbard. The lineage runs back further than the town below her, further than the mining that cut into the mountains behind her, further than the European names on the charts. There are roughly 3,000 polar bears in Svalbard, more bears than people. She lifts her head into the wind. Whatever she is, reading in it, she reads without hurry. The cubs were born in January, in a snow den, in total darkness, while the polar night held this archipelago completely still. They weigh less than a kilogram at birth. By spring, when the den opens and the light returns, they weigh 30. She walks on. The cubs follow, staying close, learning the particular geography of a landscape that has not changed its fundamental character in 10,000 years. In 1901, an American businessman named John Munro Longyear sailed to Svalbard as a tourist. He was wealthy, observant, and not easily distracted from opportunity. When he noticed the black seams of coal running through the cliffs above Adventfjorden, he understood immediately what they represented. He returned in 1906 with the Arctic Coal Company and began constructing Mine 1 in the valley below. The settlement that grew around the mine was called Longyear City. It would not be renamed Longyearbyen, the Norwegian word for Longyear town, until 1926. But from the beginning, it bore his name. The work was brutal. The valley was not built for human comfort. The coal seams ran thin and tight. In some tunnels, no more than 60 to 90 centimeters from floor to ceiling. The miners lay flat to work. They dragged themselves through passages that barely admitted a human body, cutting coal from the mountain by hand, in the dark, in temperatures that required insulated clothing to survive even underground. Everything in Longyearbyen belonged to the company that employed you. Housing was company housing. The canteen was the company canteen. The store was the company store. There was no living here without working here, and working here meant going into the mountain every morning, knowing, in the way that miners always know, that the mountain might not let you out. In 1916, Longyear sold his interests to a Norwegian company. Store Norske Spitsbergen Kulkompani, the big Norwegian, took over the operations and wood. go on to run coal mines in Svalbard for over a century. 7 mines eventually. At their peak, millions of tons of coal each year. The coal heated every home in this town through winters that could kill an unprotected person within hours of exposure. The coal was the reason the town existed. The coal was the reason people could survive here at all. And the coal, eventually, was what the town would have to learn to live without. January 3rd, 1920. Mine 1. The eastern side of the valley. A coal dust explosion at roughly 6 in the morning, the first shift underground. 26 men die. Some of them are buried in the cemetery at the edge of town, in the permafrost that will later be closed to all new burials. Their crosses still stand above ground that has held them for over 100 years. Store Norsk erected a memorial at the base of Mine 1 mountain in 2016 on the company's centenary. All the names of all who have died in the company's service are inscribed on it. It is a long list. What Longyearbyen looks like today is not what you expect from the world's northernmost town. There is a university, a hospital, a cinema, a swimming pool, colorful wooden houses climbing the hillside above the fjord, reds and yellows and blues that seem almost defiant against the gray sky. There are restaurants serving reindeer and king crab. There is a blues festival held in late October at the beginning of the polar night because someone decided that if the dark was coming, it might as well arrive with music. Roughly 40 nationalities live here. The town exists outside the Schengen area, a consequence of the 1920 Svalbard Treaty, which granted Norway sovereignty but guaranteed signatory nations equal access to the archipelago's resources. You need a passport to enter, even arriving from mainland Norway. But once you are here, any person from any treaty nation can live and work without a visa. The result is a town that belongs to everyone and to no one at the same time. There is a custom in Longyearbyen that every newcomer learns within hours of arriving. The moment you step inside any building, any home, any office, any bar, you remove your shoes. Not because of the cold, not simply as a hygiene rule. The custom has a specific origin. It began with coal dust. For nearly a century, miners walked from the mine entrances back into the settlement, and the coal came with them. It was in the creases of their hands, on the backs of their necks, on every surface they touched. Removing your shoes at the door was how you kept the worst of it out of your living space. It was how you drew a line between the work and the life. Mine 7, the last operating Norwegian coal mine in Svalbard, closed permanently on June 30th, 2025. A miner named Svein Johnny Olbritzen had worked underground since 1985. He started at his first mine when he was 28 years old, the same age as many of the men whose names are on the memorial at Mine 1. He bounced between several operations over the decades. He spent the last 24 years at Mine 7, eventually as head of security. On closing day, he performed his final safety check. He walked the tunnels he had walked for nearly a quarter century. He checked the systems. He documented what he found. Then, he removed his headlamp and walked out of the mountain for the last time. The custom of removing shoes at the door remains. The miners are gone. The gesture endures. The valley behind Longyearbyen is called Adventdalen. It stretches east into the interior of Spitsbergen, flat and wide, bounded by mountains whose slopes are marked with dark seams of ancient coal, visible at a distance like brushstrokes on stone. The valley floor in summer is a pale green tundra, thin-soiled and low, a carpet of grasses and mosses and dwarf willows that grow no taller than an adult's knee because the cold does not permit more. Svalbard sits at a latitude where the relationship between the sun and the earth is not subtle. The midnight sun runs here from April 20th until August 23rd, 125 days of continuous daylight. The sun does not set. It simply circles, low and persistent, above a horizon it never crosses. The polar night begins in late October. By the 26th, the sun has gone entirely. It will not return, not to most of the valley floor, which remains in mountain shadow until mid-February. 113 days of dark. The people who live through it describe it differently, depending on who they are. Some find the polar night oppressive, some find it clarifying. The darkness is not complete. There is blue twilight for a few hours at midday, and on clear nights, the moon reflecting off the snow provides real light. And occasionally, the aurora appears overhead in green and violet sheets. But it is dark. For months, it is dark. And then, in early March, the light begins to return. The Sun Festival week, Solfastuka, marks the moment when sunlight first reaches the valley floor after months of shadow. The town holds events. Residents stand outside looking east, watching for the moment the light comes around the mountain. Those who have lived through the polar night and seen the sun return say you understand something in that moment that you cannot explain to anyone who has not stood in this valley and waited. The rusted cableway towers still stand in Longyearbyen, rising from the hillside and crossing the valley floor toward the old harbor. They are heritage now, architectural monuments to the industry that built this town, left in place when the coal operations finally wound down. For most of the 20th century, those towers carried coal. Hundreds of tons every day, moving from the mine entrances at elevation down to the harbor in heavy buckets, hour after hour, through every season. In the town center, a public sculpture stands at street level. A coal miner cast in dark iron, life-size. He holds a pickaxe. His face is set in an expression that is neither triumphant nor defeated, but simply present. The face of a man who has more work to do and knows it. The town has moved beyond what those men did for a living. It has not moved beyond the fact of them. The little orcs arrive in spring as sound before they appear as sight. A high, chattering roar that moves down from the cliffs before the birds do. Then suddenly, they are everywhere. Millions of them, nesting on cliff faces above the fjords in densities so extreme that entire mountainsides seem to move. They are small birds, smaller than a human fist. They dive to depths of 30 meters, pursuing the tiny crustaceans that drift in the cold water near the ice edge. A single bird makes dozens of dives in a day. A colony of 1 million breeding pairs can transfer tens of thousands of tons of nutrients from the sea to the land in a single breeding season. They are the reason the tundra is as green as it is, where it is green. Their droppings fertilize bare rock. Their presence supports the entire coastal food web. Arctic foxes taking eggs and chicks, polar bears occasionally following them to cliff bases, the tundra vegetation growing dense wherever colonies nest. The whole ecology of this coastline runs, in part, on the energy carried up from the sea by birds the size of a closed fist. By late summer, they are gone. They vanish south before the polar night arrives, following the retreating edge of open water. The cliffs fall silent, and the tundra they have fertilized goes through the winter on what they left behind. The Spanish flu arrived in Longyearbyen in October 1918 on a supply ship from the mainland. In the global pandemic that year, the virus killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. It moved with unusual speed and particular cruelty toward healthy adults in their 20s and 30s, not the elderly or the very young, as most influenza strains do, but the people in the prime of their physical lives. The young miners of Longyearbyen were exactly the demographic the 1918 strain preferred. 7 men died that autumn, all of them between 18 and 29. All of them newly arrived from mainland Norway, workers recruited that year for the expanding mining operations. They were buried in the cemetery at the edge of town, deep in the frozen ground, as was the practice for anyone who died on Svalbard in those years. They were buried. The permafrost closed around them. And then, over the following decades, it held. The discovery came gradually. By the 1950s, the residents of Longyearbyen had begun to understand that something unusual was happening in their cemetery. Bodies that should have decomposed, that in any ordinary ground on any ordinary continent would have broken down over years and decades into the soil, were not decomposing. The permafrost was preserving them in a state between death and disappearance that normal burial does not produce. The implications arrived with the understanding. If the bodies were preserved, then whatever those bodies had been carrying when they died was also preserved. Bacteria, virus, whatever had killed them. The cemetery was closed to new burials. For decades, the question remained theoretical. No one knew with certainty what the 1918 miners were holding in their frozen tissue. No living sample of the Spanish flu virus existed anywhere in the world. The virus had never been fully analyzed. Its genetic structure was unknown. Then, in 1998, medical geographer Dr. Kirsty Duncan assembled an international team of virologists, pathologists, and permafrost scientists and came to Longyearbyen to find out. The team exhumed 6 of the miners. They worked in full biohazard protocols in this small cemetery at the edge of an Arctic town, on the graves of men who had been in the ground for 80 years. What they found in the lung tissue was extraordinary. The Spanish flu virus was still present, intact. The permafrost had maintained the biological material at a temperature and humidity that prevented the virus from degrading over 8 decades. For the first time, scientists had access to the actual genetic structure of the 1918 strain. The research that followed changed what the world understands about pandemic influenza. It allowed scientists to reconstruct the complete genome of the 1918 virus. It changed how researchers think about the evolution of lethal influenza strains. It contributed directly to the development of influenza vaccines that would be used in subsequent decades. It came from 6 graves in a small cemetery in the Arctic, where the ground had refused to let go of the dead. This is the actual logic of the burial ban in Longyearbyen. Not theatre, not a quirk, not a law that punishes dying. What the town established in the 1950s was a biosecurity protocol based on a specific and verifiable threat. The permafrost will preserve whatever you put into it, and you do not always know, at the time of burial, what that thing is carrying. The cemetery still accepts cremated remains housed in urns, which do not present the same biological risk. That practice requires a state license and remains tightly controlled. But coffin burials, the kind that preserve organic material in the frozen ground for decades or centuries, have not been permitted since the 1950s. The last burial of that kind in Longyearbyen happened over 70 years ago. The crosses from those older graves still lean in the frozen ground. The people beneath them are still there, exactly as they were placed. The Svalbard reindeer are not what you expect. They are smaller than their mainland relatives, built closer to the ground, stockier with shorter legs. Their winter coats are thick and pale, almost white, so that a group of them on a snowfield disappears into the landscape as if they are part of it. They are one of the few large mammals that winters on Svalbard year-round. There is nowhere to migrate to. They simply stay, digging through snow with their hooves to reach the dried mosses and grasses beneath, slowing their metabolism during the deepest cold, moving less, eating more, waiting. They have been here for at least 5,000 years, isolated enough from other reindeer populations to become their own subspecies. No wolves exist on Svalbard. There are no wolves in the evolutionary memory of these animals. The only predator large enough to take an adult reindeer here is a polar bear, and bears rarely bother. A small group grazes on a south-facing hillside above the valley, where the snow has thinned enough to expose the tundra beneath. They move slowly, heads down. They are not hurrying. The Arctic requires patience of everything that lives here. The reindeer, over 5 millennia, have learned this more thoroughly than anything else. By 1941, the strategic calculus of the Second World War had reached even Svalbard. The archipelago sat along the supply routes between Allied Atlantic ports and the Soviet Union. Its coal mines produced fuel that Germany needed for its northern operations. Its weather stations gathered meteorological data that both sides required for coordinating operations across the North Atlantic. In August 1941, the British Army launched Operation Gauntlet. They arrived in Svalbard not to defend it, but to deny it. The Norwegian and Soviet miners were evacuated. The coal stockpiles were set alight. The fuel supplies were destroyed. The Norwegians, following orders from their government in exile, set fire to the town that their fathers and grandfathers had spent 30 years building. Longyearbyen burned. Then Germany occupied the archipelago anyway. They used the weather stations for military intelligence until late in the war, while British forces completed the destruction of mine infrastructure on other parts of the island. By the time the war ended and the Norwegians returned, they came back to rubble. They rebuilt, quickly. By 1950, the mines were running again. The company town had resumed its rhythms, and Longyearbyen was once more a functioning Arctic settlement. The speed of the reconstruction says something about the people this place attracted. They were not people who required comfortable conditions before they would work. They were people who came to a place others had burned and started digging. The boat from Longyearbyen moves east through Isfjorden in the long Arctic light of a summer evening. The water dark grey and flat, the mountains on either side descending directly into the fjord with no beach between them. Just rock and snow, and then sea. After 2 hours, the channel narrows. The water changes color. Billefjorden is shallower than Isfjorden, and the glacial flour suspended in it, rock ground to powder by moving ice, turns the water a deep, opaque blue. And then, at the end of the fjord, under a pyramid-shaped mountain that rises clean and sharp against the sky, something appears that should not be there. A town, streets, buildings, industrial structures, the rusted rails of a funicular climbing the mountainside, a cultural center, a hotel, a sports hall, a complete Soviet settlement standing in the Arctic in apparent silence. Not a ruin, not a collapse, a town, intact, with no one in it. Pyramiden was founded by a Swedish company in 1910 and sold to the Soviet Union in 1927. The state-owned mining company Kugel took control in the early 30s and began developing the settlement according to a specific vision. Not just an industrial outpost, but a demonstration of what Soviet collective life could achieve in the most inhospitable conditions on Earth. At its peak in the 1980s, more than 1,000 people lived here. The settlement had everything: a school and a kindergarten, a cultural center with a swimming pool, one of the northernmost in the world, a cinema, a library, a cafeteria serving hot meals to every resident, a concert hall where the local ensemble performed Russian folk music. The farm was the most extraordinary detail. Svalbard's ground produces nothing without intervention. So the Soviets imported soil from Siberia, shipped it across the Barents Sea in containers, transferred it to the island, and spread it around the central square. They built a cowshed, a pigsty, a hen house, and heated greenhouses. In the greenhouses, they grew tomatoes, lettuce, cucumbers. In the middle of the Arctic, a Soviet collective farm, sustained by Siberian soil and the determination to prove that the communist model could flourish anywhere. The grass that grew around the central square was Siberian grass. It still grows there today. Pyramiden was never profitable. The coal was poor quality. The seams were difficult. Kugel lost money every year, subsidized by the Soviet state, not because the economics justified the cost, but because of where the settlements sat. The 1920 Svalbard Treaty guaranteed signatory nations equal access to the archipelago. Russia's coal mines were the legal basis for a permanent Soviet, and later Russian, presence on Norwegian sovereign territory. The settlements at Pyramiden and Barentsburg were not primarily about coal. They were about the right to be here, on Norwegian land, inside the Norwegian Arctic, 400 kilometers from the Kola Peninsula, where the Soviet Northern Fleet kept its nuclear submarines. That calculation justified any subsidy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the subsidy thinned. Workers were laid off. The schools closed. Children were sent back to the mainland. The settlement contracted, slowly at first, then faster, the population dropping from over 1,000 to a few hundred to a handful. Then, on August 29, 1996, a Vnukovo Airlines charter approached Svalbard Airport in poor visibility, carrying miners and their families returning to Pyramiden from Moscow. The aircraft flew into the side of Operafjellet mountain at an altitude of approximately 190 meters. All 141 people on board were killed. The victims were not strangers to Svalbard. They were residents, families with children who had spent years in this remote settlement, making a life in the Arctic at the request of a state that could no longer afford to support them. Ecology could not recover from the disaster. The mining had already been failing. On March 31st, 1998, the last ton of coal was extracted from the mountain. The machinery stopped. And over the following months, without announcement, without ceremony, without a formal farewell, the town emptied. People departed on the next available boat or helicopter. They packed what they could carry in a single bag. They left everything else in place. The dishes were left on the cafeteria shelves. The sheets were left folded on the beds. The equipment in the gymnasium was left where it had last been used. In a classroom in the school, something was written on the chalkboard in Russian, in a child's handwriting. The chalk has not been erased. The last permanent resident departed on October 10, 1998, leaving Pyramiden to the Arctic and whatever else moved into it. An Arctic fox moves through the main street of Pyramiden on a summer morning, unhurried, reading the air with the confidence of a creature that has understood, over the 25 years since the humans left, that this place now belongs to it. It pauses at the entrance to the cafeteria building. It reads the base of the door with its nose for a moment, decides there is nothing there, and continues. Inside, if you look through the window, clean plates are still stacked on the shelves. A mural of the Russian countryside covers the far wall. Birch trees, a summer field, something that looks like home. The chairs are pushed back from the tables as though the residents have only stepped outside for a moment and will return. The fox disappears around the corner of a building. Today, 6 people live in Pyramiden year-round. Caretakers and guides employed by Ecology to maintain the infrastructure and receive the tourists who arrive by boat in summer. One of them is Alexander Romanovsky. He arrived in 2012, the first person to return to Pyramiden as a permanent resident after the abandonment. He is a musician and a tour guide. He knows which buildings are structurally sound and which are not. He knows which rooms still hold the belongings of people who packed a single bag in 1998 and decided the rest was not worth the weight of carrying. He walks these streets every day. He plays music in the concert hall of the cultural center for summer tourists and for the silence the rest of the year. He calls himself, without apparent irony, the world's most northern headbanger. He chose to live in a ghost town because, as he has said, there is nowhere else quite like it, and because someone should be here to explain what it was. In a place defined by preservation, the choice to stay is its own kind of refusal to let things disappear. What does Russia still want in Svalbard? Barentsburg, to the southwest, has the answer, or at least the most visible part of it. The Russian settlement never closed. Roughly 500 people still live there, employed by Ecology, maintained by a state subsidy that has continued long after the economics of coal ceased to justify it. The Lenin bust in the town center has stood through the Soviet collapse and everything that came after. A local dance ensemble still performs Russian folk music for summer visitors. The Kola Peninsula, where Russia's nuclear-armed Northern Fleet is based, lies roughly 400 kilometers south of Svalbard. As Arctic sea ice retreats, and it is retreating at a rate that would have seemed impossible to forecast 30 years ago, new shipping routes through the high Arctic become viable. New areas of the seabed become accessible for resource extraction. New military geometry becomes relevant. In 2022, Russian trawlers were tracked in the waters near Svalbard as a communications cable connecting the archipelago to mainland Norway was severed. Norwegian authorities documented the incident. No official cause was established. In May 2025, Britain's Foreign Secretary traveled to Svalbard specifically to affirm defense and intelligence cooperation with Norway in the high Arctic. The visit was deliberate. The statement was clear. The islands that once sat at the edge of the navigable world are becoming its center. And in the ghost town at the end of Billefjorden, Alexander Romanovsky plays music in an empty auditorium, under the watchful gaze of a Lenin bust with a view of the glacier. The Soviet Union dissolved. Its buildings in the Arctic still stand, maintained by a state that has not stopped watching. The belugas arrive in Billefjorden in summer, moving in small pods through the glacial blue water. They are vocal animals. Underwater, their calls carry across the fjord and echo off the glacier faces. Clicks, whistles, low, resonant tones that travel through cold water with extraordinary clarity. They have been called the canaries of the sea, a name that understates them. Each pod develops calls that are distinct from other pods, regional dialects that pass from parents to offspring across generations. They are feeding here, working the fjord for fish and crustaceans below the surface. The glacier at the far end of Billefjorden calves periodically, ice separating from the face with a sound like a distant cannon, the chunks falling into the water and drifting. The belugas surface in slow arcs around them, indifferent. They have been making this journey, following the retreating ice north in spring, following it south again in autumn, for longer than any human record of Svalbard exists. The people came and went, the settlement was built, the settlement emptied. The belugas kept moving through the fjord. They will leave when the ice calls them south. They will return. There is a mountain outside Longyearbyen with a door cut into its side. The door is not dramatic. A wedge of reinforced concrete jutting from the snow-covered slope. A steel entrance panel. A single light above the threshold. From a distance, it looks like a utility structure, something functional and unglamorous. The kind of thing you walk past without looking twice. What it contains is harder to describe without the numbers first losing their meaning. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault opened on February 26, 2008. Inside the mountain, a tunnel drills 100 meters straight through the permafrost into the solid bedrock. At the end of the tunnel, behind reinforced steel doors, 3 separate chambers sit in permanent cold, each maintained at -18 degrees Celsius. Each sealed, humidity-controlled, monitored continuously from servers on the mainland. Floor to ceiling, the chambers are lined with black aluminium boxes. As of 2025, the vault holds more than 1.3 million seed varieties from nearly every country on Earth. Wheat from Ethiopia, rice from the Philippines, corn varieties from Mexico that have been cultivated in the same valleys for 4,000 years, wild relatives of barley and sorghum, strains of cassava developed over centuries by farmers who have never heard of Svalbard. The genetic building blocks of every civilization that has ever fed itself from the ground. The popular press calls it the Doomsday Vault. The name is both accurate and insufficient. The man who conceived it was an American conservationist named Cary Fowler. Fowler had spent decades studying what happens to crop diversity as agriculture industrializes. What he found was a pattern of quiet, cumulative loss that rarely made headlines, because no single event caused it. Farmers adopting high-yield commercial varieties abandoned the older strains their grandparents had grown. Traditional varieties, adapted over centuries to specific soils, specific climates, specific patterns of disease and drought, simply stopped being planted. When no one plants a variety for long enough, the seeds lose their viability. The variety is gone permanently. Not like a building that can be rebuilt, like a species that has gone extinct. Once a crop variety disappears, the traits it carried, its particular disease resistance, its tolerance for drought, its adaptation to a specific altitude or soil type, disappear with it. Fowler documented the scale of the problem. An estimated 90% of historic fruit and vegetable varieties that existed in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century had already disappeared by the time he was working. Around the world, thousands of unique strains of wheat, rice, and corn, the crops that feed the majority of the human population, had been lost. The institutions built to protect what remained were fragile. The world's 1,700 gene banks, national and international repositories that maintain seed collections, were vulnerable in ways that were easy to overlook until something went wrong. The National Gene Bank of the Philippines was damaged by flooding from a typhoon, then destroyed by fire. The gene banks of Afghanistan and Iraq were lost entirely during conflict. A gene bank in Aleppo, Syria, one of the world's most significant repositories of wheat varieties adapted to the soils of the ancient Fertile Crescent, became inaccessible as civil war consumed the city. When Fowler described what he was trying to prevent, he did not use apocalyptic language. He called it the drip, drip, drip extinction. The quiet, steady disappearance of options that no single catastrophe causes, that accumulates invisibly, variety by variety, year by year, until the day you need something that is no longer there. The Svalbard Vault was his answer to that kind of disappearance. How does a seed survive for centuries in a mountain? The seeds are dried to a precise moisture level before shipping, typically between 3 and 7% water content. At that level, the metabolic processes of the seed slow to near zero. The seed is alive, but barely. At -18 degrees, it can remain viable for decades, for centuries, for, in the case of some varieties, millennia. The seeds are packaged in custom 3-ply foil, heat-sealed, placed into protective boxes, and deposited in the chambers. The cold of the permafrost around the vault provides passive refrigeration. Even if the mechanical cooling systems failed entirely, it would take roughly 200 years for the chamber temperature to rise to zero. The vault was built 130 meters above sea level, above even the most extreme projections of future sea rise. Its location was chosen for geological stability. Svalbard has no significant seismic activity. Its remoteness removes it from the zones of political instability where gene banks have historically been threatened. The Norwegian government funded the construction entirely, $8 million, less than the purchase price of a single commercial aircraft. Depositing seeds is free to all countries. Norway pays the operational costs. The seeds remain the legal property of whoever sent them. When the vault opened in 2008, more than 320,000 seed samples arrived in the first days. Countries that had spent years preparing their deposits sent representatives to Svalbard for the opening ceremony. The Prime Minister of Norway was there, the President of the European Commission, the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Wangari Maathai. For a vault that Fowler had feared no one would find interesting, the world arrived in numbers. The first withdrawal came in 2015. The International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas had maintained a gene bank near Aleppo for decades. The collection held thousands of seed varieties from across the Middle East, wheat strains adapted to the soils of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq. Crop varieties that represented millennia of agricultural knowledge accumulated in the region where agriculture was invented. As the Syrian civil war consumed the city, the Aleppo gene bank became inaccessible. The original collection was in danger. The scientists who had managed it evacuated. They withdrew their seeds from Svalbard. Using the duplicate samples stored inside the mountain, they established two new regional seed banks, one in Lebanon, one in Morocco, and restored the collection. The seeds of Syria's agricultural heritage, carried out of a burning city and preserved in a frozen mountain 6,000 kilometers north, were returned to the world. This is what the vault was built for. Not the apocalypse, the smaller disasters, the specific ones, the ones that happen to real places, to real people, on ordinary days of a war that will not end. Then, in October 2016, water appeared in the entrance tunnel of the seed vault. Not a catastrophic flood, not a structural failure, water seeping through the permafrost and into the access tunnel, advancing 15 meters before the temperature dropped enough to freeze it in place. The inner chambers remained dry. No seeds were at risk, but the incident alarmed the scientific community because of what had caused it. The permafrost was thawing. Svalbard is warming at a rate approximately 3 times the global average. The archipelago has experienced some of the most dramatic temperature increases recorded anywhere on Earth over the past century. More than 4 degrees Celsius in the long-term average, with individual winters running 6, 7, 8 degrees above what they once were. Glaciers are retreating across the archipelago. Sea ice seasons are shortening. Permafrost, that has been stable for millennia, is beginning to soften at its edges. The wooden piles sunk into the permafrost beneath Longyearbyen's buildings, the foundations of the town, are rotting as the ground around them changes temperature. In December 2015, an avalanche struck a residential area in Longyearbyen, at a time of year when avalanches in that location had not historically occurred. The wall of snow moved houses 20, 30 meters. It killed a child and an elementary school teacher. Dozens of people were seriously injured. The changing permafrost, the changing avalanche risk, the changing temperature of the water seeping into the mountain. Norway invested $12 million in 2018 to rebuild and waterproof the access tunnel of the seed vault. The work was completed. The seeds are safe for now. But here is what the vault's designers could not have fully anticipated in 2004 when they conducted the feasibility study. Svalbard was chosen because it was cold. It was cold because of a climatic stability that had held for thousands of years. That stability is now the thing that is changing. The vault that was built to outlast every foreseeable human catastrophe is now threatened by a gradual one. Not a war, not a disaster, not a single moment of failure, but the slow, cumulative warming of a planet that has burned too much carbon. Too much of the fuel that came, in part, from the coal seams of this very mountain. The mine that made Longyearbyen possible contributed, fractionally, to the process that is now threatening the thing Longyearbyen chose to hold. Consider what Svalbard is keeping. In the permafrost, beneath the cemetery at the edge of town, the Spanish flu virus has been preserved for over 100 years in the lung tissue of men who died at 23. Intact. The ground refused to let them go. In the ghost town at the end of Billefjorden, a Lenin bust watches over Siberian grass and clean plates still stacked on cafeteria shelves in a settlement that officially emptied in 1998 and has not been erased. In the mountain above Longyearbyen, 1.3 million varieties of the food that feeds human civilization are sealed in -18 degrees, waiting for the moment when someone somewhere needs what they contain. In another abandoned mine on the edge of town, a Norwegian company called Pyramiden has built the Arctic World Archive, a data vault. Government records, cultural documents, national archives, the complete source code of the world's open-source software, encoded on photosensitive film and sealed inside the mountain. The Vatican's archives, the records of Brazil, Mexico, Norway, dozens of other nations. Digital. The coal came out of these tunnels for 120 years and powered the lights of Europe. What goes in now is everything the world is most afraid to lose. This is not a coincidence of geography. Svalbard's capacity for preservation does not discriminate. It has never distinguished between what should be kept and what should be released. The permafrost held the 1918 flu virus because it holds everything organic at the same temperature with the same indifference. The cold that keeps seeds viable at -18 is the same cold that kept the virus intact in frozen lung tissue. The same cold that held Pyramiden in suspension from 1998 onward, preserving the chalkboard writing and the folded sheets and the dishes stacked on their shelves. This is the specific logic that chose this place. Not sentiment, not symbolism. The code here is reliable. The remoteness is structural. The geology is stable. The politics are as close to neutral as any place on Earth governed by the 1920 treaty. Or were. As the Arctic warms, each of these conditions is under pressure. The permafrost is softening at its edges. What is held in the permafrost of Svalbard is not only the contents of a cemetery and a seed vault. It is a record of the Arctic environment itself, ancient organic material, preserved plant matter, the biological data of thousands of years of Arctic ecology, held at a temperature that prevents it from reacting with the present. As the permafrost thaws, that material will begin to enter the atmosphere and the water table. This is not hypothetical. In northern Siberia in 2016, a heat wave thawed a layer of permafrost containing reindeer carcasses from the early 20th century. An anthrax outbreak followed, infecting over 2,000 reindeer and hospitalizing more than 90 people. A child died. The pathogen that caused the outbreak had been held in the frozen ground for over 70 years. This is what the burial ban in Longyearbyen understands. This is the original logic of this place, stated not as policy, but as fact. The cold keeps things. When the cold goes, the things it was keeping come back. The light of the Arctic summer evening falls long and amber across the valley of Adventdalen. The cableway towers cast shadows across the tundra. The mine entrances on the hillside are dark. Mine 7 is closed. The last Norwegian coal miner in Svalbard, Svein Johnny Olbritzen, removed his headlamp and walked out of the mountain for the final time in June 2025. The seed vault entrance glows quietly against the snow above the town. Inside it, the first seeds ever deposited, placed there in 2008, are in the same sealed foil packages at the same temperature as the day they arrived. They have not aged. They have simply waited. In Pyramiden, Alexander Romanovsky is preparing to lead the last boat tour of the day through the empty settlement. He will explain the cultural center, the Soviet farm, the gymnasium with its abandoned equipment. He will stand in the auditorium and describe what it sounded like when the ensemble played. He has told this story hundreds of times. He tells it the same way each time because that is how you keep a story intact. When the tourists leave, he will be alone in Pyramiden. Again. By choice. The wooden crosses in the Longyearbyen cemetery lean slightly in the frozen ground. The permafrost does not change all at once. It changes in layers, from the surface downward, slowly, over decades. The bodies below the crosses are still there. What they are carrying is still there. The ground still holds. But every summer, the active layer, the top meter of permafrost that thaws and refreezes with the seasons, goes a little deeper than it used to. Each year, the frozen ground remembers slightly less of its old temperature. What it has kept in trust. The trust is being tested by a warming it did not cause and cannot negotiate with. This is the paradox that Svalbard cannot resolve. A place chosen to preserve the most important things in the world, chosen specifically because its cold was reliable and its remoteness was structural, is now at the leading edge of the change that makes cold less reliable and remoteness less relevant. The cold had built this town and kept it warm, contributed to the process now threatening the vault inside the mountain. The warming threatening the seed vault is the same warming exposing the 1918 flu virus in the cemetery below it. The same warming retreating the glaciers that have covered 60% of these islands for as long as people have had records. Svalbard is not a passive victim of climate change. It is one of its most precise instruments. The place where the readings are clearest, where the changes are most measurable, where the consequences of what humanity has burned are most legible in the landscape. Mine 7 is closed. The last Norwegian coal mine in Svalbard. The industry that created Longyearbyen, gone. What remains is a town negotiating its next 100 years in real time, in a landscape that is changing around it at a rate that no generation before this one has experienced. There is one detail about the seed vault that most visitors never learn. The entrance to the vault was built at an angle to the slope that aligns it, in midwinter, with the rising of the full moon. In the polar night, the 4 months of total darkness when the sun does not cross the horizon, the full moon, reflecting off the snow, provides the primary light on this landscape. The architects oriented the entrance toward that light because it was the light that would be available when the sun was not. In the deepest winter, the seed vault entrance glows in reflected moonlight on the mountain above Longyearbyen. Not dramatically, not visibly from far away, but deliberately, precisely, because the people who designed this place were not thinking about the day it opened. They were thinking about what the mountain would look like in 200 years, when no one who built it is alive, when it holds more than it holds today, when whoever comes to stand at its entrance will need to understand that someone once thought about them. This is what Svalbard is. Not a curiosity, not a destination famous for a misunderstood rule about dying. not only a ghost town frozen in 1998, or a vault of seeds, or a cemetery where the permafrost refused to finish its work. It is a place that has been in the business of preservation for as long as people have come here. The whalers rendered blubber in the cold and shipped light to Europe. The miners cut coal from the mountain and sent heat through a continent. The permafrost preserved the flu virus for 8 decades without being asked. The ground held the buildings of Pyramiden without changing them. And now, deliberately, at a scale that is difficult to comprehend, the world is using the cold of this archipelago to hold the things it cannot afford to lose. The seeds of 4,000 years of agriculture, the source code of the software that runs 2 billion devices, the genetic memory of a civilization that is beginning, slowly, to understand how fragile its own continuity is. All of it here, in the cold, at the edge of the navigable world. What is strange is not the burial ban. What is strange is that the permafrost has been doing this, holding, preserving, refusing to release, for millennia without human instruction. The 1920 miners were not placed in the frozen ground because someone wanted to preserve them. They were placed there because that is where the dead were put. The permafrost held them anyway because that is what it does. The seed vault is the human version of that refusal. The deliberate construction of a cold place to hold what the warm world cannot be trusted to keep. And the seed vault, like the cemetery, like Pyramiden, like the 1918 virus in the frozen lung of a 23-year-old miner, is now in a race with the temperature. The cold is still here. For now, it holds. What it will hold in 50 years, what the permafrost will keep, and what it will release, is the question that the scientists in this valley, and the people who built the vault in the mountain, and the miners whose names are on the memorial at the base of Mine 1, are all, in their different ways, part of the answer to. If this journey has taken you somewhere unexpected, to an archipelago at the edge of the world where the ground itself keeps secrets, where a Soviet town stands intact in the Arctic silence, where the seeds of human civilization wait in a mountain for whatever comes next, consider subscribing and join us for the next one. There is always more world to see.